Basically, we were turned into what I like to call sheep. We were there ripe for the picking for both by criminal and the government.
Carlos Santillan, now an American citizen, remembers all too well the freedoms he and his family were denied. Growing up in the Philippines, where Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law, putting honest citizens at the mercy of his dictatorship, ordering them to register their firearms, and then forcing them to turn them in.
This is my brother and my father. They're in Mexico here.
For Joseph DeSoto, a flight to freedom is what brought his family here. Photos of relatives, a constant reminder, he says, of how his ancestors, an entire village, was betrayed and massacred by the Mexican government, a government that promised to protect them from armed rebels and marauders.
The reason my family is here in the United States now is that my relatives were exterminated by government forces which were in the northern part of Mexico to protect the ranchers and the villagers. Well, they disarmed the ranchers, they disarmed the villagers, and 3 days later they killed all the men.
The harsh lessons of history never learned, where the loss of liberty is paid for in the loss of innocent lives, a tragedy that continues to be played out today. In England, Australia, Canada, and South Africa, where firearms have been banned, rounded up, and surrendered to the saw blade and blast furnace, crime has skyrocketed.
The facts are simply armed crime's gone up, and more firearms are being imported into England illegally.
Once upon a time, people's houses would be broken in when they weren't home. What's happening today is that the offender, the bad guys, are happy to break into somebody's house. They're not frightened to break into somebody's house while they're at home.
Gun bans that have backfired, but governments refusing to admit it. Instead, these same countries are now conspiring with the United Nations, insisting that the only way to combat the illegal possession of firearms is to restrict, reduce, and ultimately remove legally owned firearms from law-abiding citizens. The UN's agenda? To impose its own standard of freedom, global gun prohibition.
The global mission would be a relatively gun-free future for the world's people.
I would agree with her entirely. But being a realist, I think, it has to be a gradual process. We cannot solve this problem in one fell swoop. But I think she's right by saying that is the goal.
That's why here at the United Nations, delegates from around the world will meet for a global conference on small arms. For the first time ever here on American soil, part of their agenda will be to regulate firearms not only held by nations, but by individual citizens. In fact, many people believe the UN's mission is to redefine your firearms freedom.
The greatest danger in a global gun control standard set by the United Nations is that we would lose the freedom that we have in this country. It would effectively be undermined.
The plan has already been scripted. In this so-called documentary by the UN, emotional images of mothers crying, child soldiers, and rampant gunfire are used to drive home the message that legal guns owned by lawful American citizens are somehow to blame for the atrocities committed by armed terrorists, genocidal rogue armies, and drug smugglers around the world, in places where freedom doesn't even exist.
Given the problems a country like Colombia has because of firearms, and because the looseness with which firearms are sold is causing a lot of violence in our country.
When you read the documents coming out of the United Nations, they refer to civilian ownership of firearms as a destabilizing thing. And they believe if we were to prohibit law-abiding citizens from owning firearms, that somehow our communities would be safer.
One gets the solid feeling that the United Nations is actually reluctant to hear the truth. Once it's got a nice campaign going, a good emotional campaign that it's doing good for the world, it doesn't want it to be disrupted by an awkward thing called the truth.
Facts that don't matter. The truth that registration won't stop criminals, warlords, or drug smugglers from getting their guns still won't stop the UN from proceeding as planned, mandating all firearms be registered in a worldwide database under the authority and oversight of the United Nations.
We need to have national laws for the registration of weapons. If I have a weapon at home, my government must know that I have that weapon.
International terrorist organizations will never comply with the laws, and what you'll wind up with is gun control on an international level specifically designed to be used against honest, law-abiding people.
Reason enough for the UN to set its sights on what it calls small arms, to regulate and eliminate them.
My definition would be fairly elastic.
But it's clear, with a definition so broad, what the UN really means is all firearms. To them, a bazooka and your Beretta, a machine gun and your hunting rifle are one and the same.
I'm not sure there's a definition of small arms. It seems, in the minds of the promoters, to mean anything that they wish it to mean.
Talk to the UN participants, and it's clear. In their utopian world of global gun control, only the police and military would be allowed to have firearms.
We're sending a very clear message out. There is no need for civilians to own handguns, and that's it.
I think in all democratic structures, I think provision is made for governmental forces. So that should really reduce, if not eliminate, the necessity for citizens to carry arms.
In the case of our country, ideally, certainly only the law enforcement people, and because that would mean then that there would be no crime.
But despite these governments insisting their citizens trust and rely on only them for protection, all too often, the innocent are left defenseless.
If you phone the police, you tell them they have been attacked on gunpoint, they say, no, come down to the station. We are also afraid we won't come. They come down and report their matter. So it's the reason why I think it is the right thing for me to have a gun.
In the Philippines, when I was growing up, the police were not only were they not always there, some of them wouldn't even act unless you paid them. And currently, from what I understand, it's still the same.
And Joseph DeSoto remembers all too well. During 2 separate trips to his homeland, he was victimized by the same government authorities sworn to protect him.
The first trip, I was robbed at gunpoint by the federales. Second trip, I'm robbed by the police. The whole idea that the government is going to protect the citizen is outrageous.
Outrageous enough for the UN to keep its plans a deep, dark secret, conducting meetings for the past several years behind closed doors, shrouded in secrecy and silence, as Jim Pankiew, a member of the Canadian Parliament, found out. Twice, Jim applied to be an observer at the UN's proceedings, and twice he was his own government.
Why an elected representative would be denied access to a meeting like that should cause great concern. But unfortunately, people seem to have their head in the sand a bit on this issue.
That's why, as Congressman Barr points out, it's vital the NRA maintain its NGO, non-governmental status, one of only 2 pro-gun NGOs to have that accreditation and access.
Even though that doesn't give the NRA a voice in the decision-making, it performs an essential function, and that is to have outside observers be able to monitor at least part of what's going on here.
So the stage is set, but UN officials stress that any politically binding agreement or treaty they approve at the Small Arms Conference is just the start.
It's a process. So I don't see this as the end-all of the process. It is another step. I think we have a long way to go.
The UN, under the guise of peace and safety, rendering your rights guaranteed by the Constitution to be meaningless as part of its new global standard of freedom.
I've talked to a United Nations representative, and they perceive the US and the Second Amendment as a serious problem which they would like to get rid of.
The Second Amendment rewritten and your rights redefined, a bronze statue of a twisted gun outside UN headquarters stands as testimony to its agenda and its determination to fulfill it. The warning from citizens who have already lived the reality: no one is immune.
The end result is that we all face the greater risk of losing our personal firearms. And it would be too pessimistic to go beyond that.
They probably won't take them away from me in my lifetime, probably. But my children will probably never own them. And their children almost certainly never own them. And that will be a bad thing for my children, for my grandchildren, and for society.
The one thing that we all have in common is our love of freedom and our sense of freedom. And really, without freedom, are we still Americans? Is this still the United States?